So good evening and welcome to tonight's event, the first lecture of the Ayn Rand Institute's 2006 series. My name is Yaron Brook and I'm the Executive Director of the Ayn Rand Institute, headquartered not far from here in Irvine. The Ayn Rand Institute, as most of you know, is a non-for-profit organization, and all of our programs are funded by private donations and the generosity of many individuals throughout the United States and around the world. We are, as always, seeking support for this series here locally, this series of talks. If you'd like to see it continue, we encourage you to talk to some of my staff in the back and about how you can help support the continuation of this series. Now, just a few announcements before we begin tonight's lecture. First, we have a bookstore. You couldn't have missed it. At the back of the room was a selection of Ayn Rand's fiction and nonfiction writing and other books and recordings that are related to tonight's talk. Also, I want to announce that the next lecture of this year's series is now scheduled for Thursday, March 23rd, and the lecture is going to be presented by me, and it will be entitled, Why Conservatives Are Anti-Business. Our speaker tonight is Peter Schwartz. Mr. Schwartz is the former chairman of the board of directors of the Ayn Rand Institute and former editorial director of its op-ed program. He was the founding editor and publisher of The Intellectual Activist, a periodical covering political, cultural, and philosophical issues. He is the editor and contributing author of Return of the Primitive, The Anti-Industrial Revolution by Ayn Rand. Mr. Schwartz also recently published a monograph, this one, entitled The Foreign Policy of Self-Interest, A Moral Ideal for America, and tonight's talk is based on that monograph. Both of Mr. Schwartz's books, as well as some tapes and I think DVDs, are available for sale tonight at the Institute's bookstore in the back. Tonight's lecture is entitled America's Foreign Policy, Self-Interest versus Self-Sacrifice. At the end of the lecture, I'll join Mr. Schwartz for questions from the audience. If you have a question at that time, we've got a mic here in the middle. Also, I want to mention that by early next week, an audio recording of tonight's lecture will be available free of charge, so let your friends know, on the Institute's website at www.aynrand.org. And now, please join me in welcoming Mr. Peter Schwartz.
Thank you. Can I be heard in the back okay? I'll be speaking for about an hour, and there'll be plenty of time for questions after that. Ask yourself this perplexing question. What explains a foreign policy under which the strongest nation on earth regularly allows itself to be thwarted by petty despots? America wages a so-called war on terror, while Iran, the world's most active state sponsor of terrorism, Iran, the patron of the terrorist group that is second only to Al-Qaeda in the number of Americans it has slaughtered, Iran, the theocracy that stormed our embassy and held 52 Americans captive for over a year as its Ayatollah's disciples pranced in the streets and chanted death to America, Iran escapes any military reprisal from us. America insists that it will not tolerate nuclear weapons in the hands of totalitarian North Korea. Yet, we permit its nuclear facilities to remain intact, and we pay it protection money for over a decade in exchange for a promise not to use those facilities. And when its ruler boasts of having violated the agreement and demands additional protection money from us, we respond not by military action, but by stating that we will not consider paying unless the negotiations are expanded to include 4 other nations. Multi-billions in U.S. foreign aid are doled out. To whom? to countries that denounce us as corrupt imperialists. America is routinely vilified in the United Nations while we continue to provide the financial and political support which makes possible the existence of that dictatorship-packed entity. Why? Why do we allow our enemies to act against us with such impunity? Why are we reluctant to stand up to other nations when we enjoy undisputed military superiority? There is certainly no physical impediment preventing us from protecting America's interests. There is, however, an intellectual one, the widely accepted idea that the pursuit of self-interest is morally wrong. The premise shaping our foreign policy is that we must sacrifice ourselves for the sake of weaker nations because self-interest cannot be the standard of our actions. Thus, if Africa needs money to deal with a medical crisis, America provides it. If Mexico needs a massive loan, America arranges it. If troops are needed in Kosovo to separate murderous ethnic clans, or in Somalia to neutralize some local warlord, or in Liberia to insert themselves among factions of a civil war, America sends the troops. Whatever rationalizations our policymakers offer for pouring American resources down a bottomless foreign aid pit, the true reason, the actual motive, is always the altruistic injunction to think of others before ourselves. That is why our government does not respond self-assertively to all foreign threats. We don't want to focus only on our own needs. We want to accommodate the concerns of the international community. We don't want to use force unilaterally against nations that pose dangers to us. We have to consider the desires of those nations as well. So we can't tell North Korea that if they don't destroy their nuclear weapons facilities, we will. We can't insist that Saudi Arabia stop funding schools that indoctrinate future jihadists. We can't order Syria to stop helping those who are killing Americans in Iraq. No, we must sympathize with others' point of view. We must respect their political needs. After all, the North Koreans or the Saudis or the Syrians may have their own complaints against America. The precept of self-sacrifice pertains not only to material goods, but to intellectual assets as well. Just as you are urged to hand over your money for the sake of others, so you are urged to surrender your convictions to the cause of altruism. Who are you to insist self-righteously on the truth of your own viewpoint? This precept demands. What about your opponent's viewpoint? Isn't one man's terrorist just another man's freedom fighter? You can't condemn any countries as being part of an axis of evil. They probably think the same of you. Never believe that you know the truth. That is too self-confident. Never decide on your own to resort to force against other nations. That is too self-assured. Be flexible, negotiate, collaborate, give in. The result of these admonitions is a U.S. foreign policy whose hallmark is self-doubt. While we do at times take military action in our defense, it is usually perfunctory. Worst of all, though, we refuse to take action to prevent disaster. For example, concerning the basic threat posed by Al-Qaeda, there is nothing we learned on September 11, 2001 that we did not know long before. Our government knew, or had the evidence to know, the nature of Osama bin Laden years earlier. It knew in 1988 that he had publicly declared a holy war in which Muslims were ordered to execute every American they could. Our government knew that al-Qaeda had launched various attacks that had killed Americans since at least 1993. It knew that bin Laden was indicted in court for 3 such attacks by federal grand juries in 1996 and in 1998. It knew since 1999 that bin Laden was on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted fugitives. It knew since 1996 that bin Laden's terrorist activities were being sponsored by the government of Afghanistan. With all this information, the principle of self-interest should have mandated the forcible elimination of the Afghani regime and of its house guest, al-Qaeda, well before September 11th. But that principle was and is absent from our self-doubting policymakers. Invading a foreign state, they feared, would have been, quote, unilateralism on our part. It would have been too selfish. Prior to the international support generated temporarily by September 11, Washington would not tolerate such an invasion. Who are we to kill others just because we think they threaten us? Shouldn't we have some empathy for people living in desperate poverty and ignorance? Shouldn't we try more diplomacy, more understanding, more compromise? And if that means increasing the risk to us, well, our policymakers believed we should not be so consumed with our own parochial problems. This attitude is what explains the bizarre phenomenon of a military superpower being paralyzed by a patently weaker opponent, an opponent whose arsenal consists of the idea that the strong must sacrifice for the weak. So we did sacrifice. Because of September 11, the lives of 3,000 people were lost, and the routines and the plans of all the rest of us have been overturned. American lives and safety were sacrificed because our government did not feel entitled to defend us by taking forceful, conclusive action against our enemies. But there is an alternative. There is an alternative to this self-inflicted impotence, and that is a foreign policy based on self-interest. So let's look at what such a foreign policy would mean. Let's look first at what it would mean in theory, and then at what it would be if put into practice. A proper, rational foreign policy regards the protection of Americans against international threats as its fundamental goal. Under such a policy, we would reject any duty to sacrifice the wealth and the lives of Americans to the needs of other nations. We would not seek the approval of other countries before deciding to use force to safeguard American interests. Nor would we try to pursue self-interest in the form of an unprincipled, amoral expediency, as advocated by the impractical pragmatists and their school of realpolitik. Rather, we would understand that self-interest can be defended only if it is embraced as a consistent moral principle, a principle in keeping with America's founding values. America is based on the recognition of individual rights. What does that mean? It means that the government may not treat the citizen as a serf, as someone who exists to serve the needs of others. Rather, each individual is a free, sovereign entity entitled to live his own life for his own sake, no matter how loudly others may cry that they need his services. To live by right means that your life belongs to you. That is why we have policemen who protect our rights when we are threatened by common criminals. Likewise, if a foreign aggressor threatens the rights of Americans, Our government is supposed to respond with force so that the citizens can remain free, free to pursue the goals they have chosen to further their own lives. These rights, however, are undercut by a foreign policy of self-sacrifice. When we send soldiers to act as altruistic peacekeepers in countries that do not threaten U.S. security, we are telling these soldiers to risk their lives in servitude to others. If America's freedom is not at risk, then a U.S. soldier is not fighting to defend his own interests. Similarly, when we fail to use military means to remove a danger to Americans, when the danger is allowed to persist because we willingly surrender our interest to the demands of the global community, then too we are sacrificing the American citizen's rights. We are telling each individual that his right to be free must be subordinated to altruistic considerations. Only a foreign policy that holds self-interest as its moral purpose is consistent with America's founding principle of liberty. This leads to a crucial question. What actually constitutes America's interests? How do we identify what is and is not in this country's interests? If you should ever get the opportunity to pose this question to any State Department official, I guarantee you will not receive a definitive answer. Instead, you'll get some vague response like, well, there can be no defining rules about our interests. That would be too confining. We have to hang loose. We just have to go by whatever seems right at the time. Now, this is not an attempt to avoid answering your question. It is what our policymakers genuinely believe. This is why even when they try to protect this country's interests, they fail dismally. They lack an objective standard. They have no way of judging whether a course of action does or does not advance America's interests. All they can do is go by the seat of their pants, which means by their emotions of the moment. So, how should we go about determining what America's interests actually are? In her system of ethics, Ayn Rand presented a validation of self-interest as man's moral purpose. More important, though, she identified what man's self-interest is. She showed that reason is our basic means of survival, and that a person's self-interest, therefore, is achieved not by instinct, nor by whim, but by the mind, by identifying the factual requirements of man's life and acting accordingly, which means by living as a rational being. Now, the concept self-interest applies fundamentally to the individual. The concept of a nation's self-interest refers to the political precondition of living rationally in a social setting. A nation's self-interest refers to what is required for man to sustain his life in society. And for that, he needs one basic thing: freedom. Without freedom, man cannot gain the values his life demands. A slave cannot pursue his interests. In politics, therefore, the government's ultimate purpose is maintaining its own citizens' liberty. The government's ultimate purpose is maintaining its own citizens' liberty. Not the pragmatic, amoral goal of preserving a, quote, balance of power, or of establishing, quote, spheres of influence, but the moral goal of keeping Americans free. Protecting the individual citizen's freedom is at root what constitutes a nation's self-interest. Freedom is the end to which all other political actions are the means. This is the standard by which a nation's interests ought to be measured, and this is where the science of foreign policy should begin. Since freedom can be breached only by the initiation of force, our foreign policy must shield us against foreign aggressors. Our government must safeguard American lives and property by using retaliatory force against any initiators. This is how our freedom is preserved. Does this mean that our government must fight for freedom wherever it is threatened in the world? No. It is true that the rise of freedom anywhere benefits us. It eliminates potential enemies, it creates new allies, it generates new sources of economic production and trade, and therefore we should always give moral support to any people who are fighting for freedom against an oppressive state. However, giving moral support does not mean declaring war on every tyrant on earth. Before we decide to wage war, there must exist a serious threat to our own freedom. By the standard of self-interest, our government is not the world's policeman. But it is America's policeman. It must defend us. And that job is primarily an intellectual one. A heavily armed military is useless when backed by an ideologically unarmed State Department. It was not the military superiority of the enemy that compelled U.S. troops to flee Vietnam in 1975, or that enabled Iran to capture our embassy in 1979, or that caused the Marines to retreat from Lebanon in 1983, or that drove American soldiers from Somalia in 1993. In all these cases, the cause of America's failure was ideological, not military weakness. The troops in Vietnam, the security guards at our Tehran embassy, the Marines in Beirut, the soldiers in Somalia, all had been ordered in effect to refrain from using the firepower available to them. Who issued those orders? The architects of our waffling foreign policy. America's armed forces are the weapon by which to fight this country's enemies. It is foreign policy, though, that decides who those enemies are and how and when the weapon is to be used. A proper foreign policy informs the world that America's commitment to safeguarding its interest is unyielding. Does this commitment to self-interest lead to increased conflicts among nations? Just the opposite. When freedom is the fundamental interest that nations are pursuing, their interests do not clash. If a nation holds the freedom of its citizens as its central value, its self-interest is not obtained at the expense of other nations. Just as in a free market, an individual's wealth is not achieved by the impoverishment of his neighbor, so too the freedom of one nation is not gained by the enslavement of another. It is not an act of altruism for America to recognize the rights of the citizens of other nations and to refrain from attacking them. The recognition of rights is precisely the principle upon which our own national interest rests. The interest of a free country lying being left alone, i.e., in not being subject to force, for the same reason that it leaves other nations alone, as long as they do not initiate a physical threat. A free country has no need and no desire for conquest. It grows prosperous by production and trade, not by coercion and oppression, which is why we don't have wars among free capitalist nations. A free country's pursuit of self-interest promotes peaceful relations because it entails no sacrifice, neither of itself to others, nor of others to itself. So, preserving America's liberty is the ultimate political goal, the ultimate end. But by what means do we achieve that end? What guidelines do we use in pursuing that ultimate end? while it is the complex task of political scientists to formulate all the relevant principles, the guidelines must start with the one virtue central to the purpose of foreign policy: the virtue of justice. Nations, like individuals, must be objectively evaluated by a rational standard before they can be dealt with. This is the process of justice, which is the basic means by which our foreign policy protects our interests. We must recognize other nations for what they actually are. We must know whether they are essentially allies or enemies of America, which means allies or enemies of liberty. Today, our foreign policy officials do not practice justice. They practice the opposite. And there is a grubby little word to describe what they do: diplomacy. Diplomacy is a world of make-believe. Diplomacy means that a dictatorship is never to be identified as a dictatorship, but rather as a, quote, strategic competitor with which we must maintain cordial relations. Justice, however, does not permit such egalitarianism. Justice requires moral discriminations. Justice demands that friendly relations be maintained only with those deserving of friendship. And this implies 4 basic rules for the conduct of a proper foreign policy. Let's look at these 4 rules. 1. Pronounce moral judgment. Our State Department should rigorously judge the world's governments by the standard of individual liberty and make its conclusions public. Harmonious relations with all nations are not a goal of foreign policy. We only undermine our freedom if we welcome or are neutral toward its destroyers. Woodrow Wilson once declared, quote, "No nation is fit to sit in judgment upon any other nation." But this is disastrously wrong. A foreign policy cannot be amoral. We should praise those who share our values and condemn those who do not, and act accordingly. This achieves the very practical purpose of telling the world that we take our ideals seriously enough to regard our enemies as enemies. By being willing to judge others, we are expressing loyalty to the value of liberty and to whatever is necessary to protect it. Number 2, do not compromise principles. Any compromise between the defenders of freedom and those who actively seek to destroy it only strengthens the destroyers at the expense of the defenders. If 2 parties share the same principle, they can legitimately compromise on certain particulars. To compromise on one's principles, however, is to surrender the end in pursuit of the means. For example, in order to induce more people to volunteer for military service, it's perfectly appropriate to offer them higher pay. That is not a compromise of principles. But to induce, say, Osama bin Laden to surrender himself, it would be ludicrous to offer to make the daily reading of the Quran mandatory in all our schools. That is an attempt to buy a little more security today at the cost of our freedom and our security tomorrow. There are no beneficial deals to be made with those who hold principles that are antithetical to ours, i.e. with those who are dedicated to our annihilation. President Bush had the right formulation when he spoke of the threat of terrorism. Quote, "Either you are with us or you are with the terrorists." And it is unforgivable that he has failed completely to follow his own uncompromising words. Similarly, you have to uphold either self-interest or self-sacrifice as a moral value, either self-protection or self-renunciation. There is no middle ground There is only self-destruction. Number 3, renounce appeasement. Appeasement is the pretense that we have no absolute enemies, only potential allies. It is the pretense that any adversary stands ready upon receipt of a sufficiently large bribe to make its interests suddenly coincide with ours. Neville Chamberlain tried to buy off Hitler in 1938 by giving him Czechoslovakia on the premise that somehow Hitler would no longer desire to enslave Poland or the rest of Europe. We saw the results of that. The U.S. government has been seeking to give autocratic control over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank to the PLO, to the Palestinian Authority now, on the premise that it will then lose its desire to bomb babies and to eliminate all Jews from what it calls Greater Palestine. We will see the tragic results of that too. There can be no equal exchange with those who offer you nothing but a promise to refrain from aggression. Appeasement is a pathetic strategy when used by a schoolboy to deal with a class bully, but it becomes an absurd act of self-effacement when practiced by the world's superpower against its enemies. Our only reliable allies are those that do not need to be bought, i.e., those with common moral and political principles. A killer pointing a gun at you is an absolute enemy. If he tells you that he really shares your ends and differs only in his choice of the means by which he earns a living, you are not likely to be persuaded to become buddies with him. The only way to protect ourselves against such physical threats is to acknowledge their existence and to retaliate with overwhelming force. Contrary to the view of our State Department, protection does not come from speaking softly and carrying a big carrot. 4, do not sanction our destroyers. The existence of any widespread tyranny, from communism to Islamic terrorism, is not possible without the moral sanction of its victims. It was because so many in the West viewed communism as a noble theory that the Soviet Union was not boycotted economically and shunned politically. It was because the Soviet Union was treated as a civilized country rather than as a brutal slaughterhouse that it obtained from the West the means of fending off starvation and of procuring a military arsenal that endangered the world for so long. Similar moral concessions on the part of the victims have led to the growing threat of terrorism today. We are often urged to avoid judging the guilty parties, especially the governments that support terrorists, strictly by Western standards. We are told to empathize with them, to empathize with those who are struggling for self-determination, or with those who need to show solidarity with their Muslim brothers in fighting American imperialism. But if we hold freedom as an objective political standard, we cannot tolerate those who are acting to destroy it. We dare not say, well, their standards may be different from ours, but we must accept a diversity of viewpoints. We must treat them as an unqualified evil. Yet every time such destroyers are permitted by us to preside over the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations, every time these tyrants are courteously invited to a State Department cocktail party, America is granting them a moral sanction, moral approval. If we care about defending ourselves, such approval must be categorically withdrawn. These are some of the principles of justice by which to implement a foreign policy of self-interest. That is, a foreign policy whose central value is America's freedom. So what does all this mean in practice? Well, The main physical danger we face today from Islamic terrorists does not come from a hodgepodge of fanatics who happen to have grudges against America. The danger stems from the ideology that motivates the fanatics, an ideology devoted to imposing by force the tenets of Islamic fundamentalism and to exterminating all infidels, starting with the United States. And what is this ideology? It is the ideology reflected in the Al-Qaeda disciples who faithfully carried out their September 11th calling. It is the ideology reflected in the frenzied mobs who burn American flags and mutilate American bodies while shouting Allah Akbar. It is reflected in the Middle East suicide bombers who enthusiastically blow up little children upon being promised eternal bliss in heaven for doing away with Islam's foes. It is reflected in the zealous believers who flock to Afghanistan and Iraq from across the globe in order to kill the hated Americans. It is reflected in the existence of the Muslim theocracies. It is the ideology of Islamic totalitarianism. This is a creed of absolute power. It begins with the premise that total control over one's life must be surrendered to the dictates of the Quran, and it proceeds to the conclusion that a holy war must be waged against all who resist. The advocates of Islamic totalitarianism wish to establish a world in which religion is an omnipresent force, in which the political system inculcates a duty to obey the mullahs, in which there is no distinction between mosque and state. The essentials of this creed permeate Muslim society, where Osama bin Laden is naturally regarded as a hero. Our conflict with Islamic totalitarianism is not a matter of geography or ethnicity. It is a product of chosen ideas. America is a nation rooted in certain principles. It is a culture of reason, of science, of individualism, of freedom. The culture of the Muslim universe is the opposite in every crucial respect. It is a culture steeped in mysticism rather than reason, in superstition rather than science, in tribalism rather than individualism, in authoritarianism rather than freedom. Bin Laden and his fellow jihadists have taken root in that culture and are seeking to establish a totalitarian world ruled by Islam. They are zealously opposed to liberty, for themselves no less than for others. The free individual, free to think for himself, to act on his own judgment, to pursue his own values, is anathema to those who believe in mysticism, who believe in mindless obedience to Allah and to his self-declared spokesman. Now, mysticism's hostility to freedom is not unique to followers of Islam. When Europe was dominated by the Catholic Church during the medieval era, the same attitude prevailed. No dissent from church doctrine was tolerated. No escape from papal commands was permitted. The massacres of the Crusades, the terror of the Inquisition, were expressions of Christianity's holy war against its infidels. Incidentally, it's ironic that during Europe's Dark Ages, it was life in the Islamic countries that was more advanced and less oppressive. It was the Muslims at that time who were better because they were under the influence of a more pro-reason philosophy, a philosophy they subsequently abandoned. But over the centuries, the West improved dramatically as a result of the Age of Enlightenment, which upheld the power and the glory of man's rational mind. The Western world went through that age, while the Muslim world did not. Consequently, Western culture has largely rejected the medieval faith in religion as the all-embracing authority, as the arbiter of every aspect of human life. In America, even religious people generally retain a certain respect for reason. That is why, for instance, there is no mass sentiment today for making the Bible into America's official constitution, as the Koran is officially Saudi Arabia's. That is why there is no mass sentiment for the sentencing of apostates to death, as is mandated by Iran's criminal code. That is why there are no Christian theocracies now, while there are Muslim ones. The Enlightenment elevated reason over faith in the Western world, but not in the Muslim world. There, religion plays the same all-powerful role today that it did in Europe in the Dark Ages. The proponents of Islamic totalitarianism thus regard the individual's pursuit of happiness on earth as evil. From sex to music to capitalistic profit, they wish all pleasure to be banished from human life. Many Muslim states have what they call ministries for the promotion of virtue and the prevention of vice, with religion police assigned to hunt down the sinful, with sin being anything from trimming one's beard, to speaking with a female nurse if you are a male doctor, to reading Agatha Christie, to flying a kite. These are all punishable offenses. In 2002, in the Saudi Arabian city of Mecca, 15 girls, ages 13 to 17, died when they were forcibly prevented from leaving a burning schoolroom. This happened, according to a BBC report, when, quote, religious police stopped schoolgirls from leaving a blazing building because they were not wearing the headscarves and black robes required by the kingdom's strict interpretation of Islam, close quote. That's why these girls were killed. The perpetrators of September 11, then, were simply Osama bin Laden's religion police. They, too, were merely enforcing the Koran's rules, punishing American transgressors as required by the same, quote, strict interpretation of Islam. Philosophically, this jihad is a war against reason, science, individualism, progress, happiness, all the values of Western civilization. Politically, it is a war against America. To win, we need to translate the danger from an abstraction to a concrete. That is, we need to identify the preeminent source of Islamic totalitarianism today, which is the Islamic Republic of Iran. There are many parties eager to take up arms against us in this battle, but Iran is their impetus. It is the wellspring of modern Islamic totalitarianism. It is a nation that was founded in 1979 by a religious revolution against a secular Western-style state. The fact that it was ruled by a despotic Shah was not what motivated the Islamists, who installed a far more tyrannical government. It was the Western orientation they found objectionable. Iran is a nation governed by clerics. It is a nation whose constitution calls for, quote, the perpetuation of the revolution inside and outside of Iran to pave the path for the unified world of Muslim nationhood, close quote. And it is a nation that has understood from the start that America is its arch enemy. Terrorism is not the essential characteristic of the danger facing America. Terrorism is simply one tactic used by Islamic totalitarians in their wider strategic offensive against the West. Consider the numerous actions of our enemies. Consider Iran's sacking our embassy and terrorizing its occupants who were held in captivity for over a year. Hamas is dispatching suicide bombers to blow up school buses. Saudi Arabia is endorsing the kidnapping of young American girls from the U.S. by their estranged Saudi fathers in order to save the children from their American mothers' quote, sinful influence. Iran's developing a nuclear bomb to be targeted against the great Satan, America. Al-Qaeda's crashing airliners into the World Trade Center. These are all parts of one whole. These are actions taken by the ideological brethren, fighting the same battle, seeking the same goals, consumed by the same hatred, and championing the same malignant doctrine of Islamic totalitarianism. And at the vanguard is Iran. Iran is the ideological inspiration for the terrorists and simultaneously their main political abettor. Our State Department calls Iran the world's most active sponsor of terrorism. According to former FBI Director Louis Freeh, Hezbollah is the exclusive terrorist agent of Iran and has, as noted, killed more Americans than any group besides Al-Qaeda. Iran is at war with America, and only America fails to grasp that fact. Instead, our government keeps trying to find some middle ground. Immediately after September 11, according to the New York Times, a senior Bush administration official actually thanked Iran for its condolences and asked for its cooperation against terrorism. This craven action is the equivalent of appealing to Hitler for help in fighting anti-Semitism. It is the quintessence of morally sanctioning our destroyers. Every single day that we allow the Iranian regime to operate is another day in which it promotes terrorism against us and another day of progress in its efforts to build nuclear weapons. Yet, we refuse to take military action against Tehran, choosing instead to have the Europeans handle this through standard diplomatic appeasement. If self-interest were driving our foreign policy, we would identify the nature of this threat to America and decide to eradicate it using whatever force is required. But being driven instead by a concern for the needs of others, our government is afraid that if we act unilaterally, we will suffer the intolerable consequences of having the world become very displeased with us. If our government were to deal properly with Iran, the chief patron of terrorism, then the lesser threats, Syria, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Pakistan, all would be deterred. Their rulers would likely stop supporting terrorism against us once they were convinced that they would not be around for long if they didn't. Our moral impotence is just as evident in our military efforts in Iraq. There, the Bush administration came up with an assortment of explanations for its decisions to remove Saddam Hussein, but could not isolate the sole non-altruistic justification, namely protecting America's safety. If some government has, or is actively seeking to acquire, weapons that could endanger the U.S., and it has shown a willingness to use them, then it is an objective threat and military action is warranted. Iraq, therefore, was a threat to us. Not nearly the threat presented by some other nations, but a threat nonetheless. Hussein was a self-declared enemy of America. He fought us in the 1991 Gulf War. He engaged our forces in sporadic combat in the years after the war. His was the only Middle East country not to offer even a perfunctory condemnation of the September 11 attacks. Hussein had biological and chemical weapons of mass destruction and had been trying to obtain and develop nuclear arms. He invaded Kuwait in 1990, threatening a source of America's oil supplies. He harbored terrorists like Abu Nidal who had murdered Americans. He gave monetary rewards to families of Middle East suicide bombers, whose victims included American citizens. He tried to have the first President Bush assassinated in 1993. These actions were sufficient grounds to get rid of Hussein's regime. Any single one of these is sufficient grounds. So our political leaders could have made the moral case for invading Iraq, the need to eliminate an aggressor's threat against us. But properly implementing the right of self-defense depends upon upholding the justness of self-interest. And our officials were unable to do so. They felt a need for altruistic reasons, a need to show that we were acting not just for ourselves, but for others, that we were relying not on our own judgment, but on the collective judgment of the world community. We were prepared to sacrifice our military values in order to secure Iraqi and world approval. We called the invasion Operation Iraqi Freedom rather than Operation American Safety. Our forces were instructed to try to spare Iraqi phone lines, power plants, TV transmission towers, despite the military benefit of destroying such targets. Even Iraq's military equipment was off limits to us if it was near what the United Nations called a historic site. Our troops were told not to damage mosques, even if enemy fire was coming from them. They were ordered to protect Iraqi civilians, even at the cost of making themselves more vulnerable. So we did whatever it took to show how selfless we could be in Iraq, including jeopardizing our own troops. After Hussein's regime was toppled, we refrained from disarming the private militias. We allowed gun-toting Hussein supporters to incite crowds to take up arms against us. We did nothing to keep Syria from permitting Ba'athist and jihadist killers to cross its borders to fight Americans in Iraq. We wanted to be sensitive to the needs of others. Today, we continue to allow U.S. troops to be murdered as we refrain from decisively wiping out the killers and all their supporters. And by supporters, I mean any nation that tolerates the killers. And I mean any of the so-called civilians who do not actively help Americans pursue the killers. We have been even more accommodating in sacrificing our intellectual values because we were uncertain of our moral right to overthrow a bloody dictator. We kept trying to obtain the blessing of the United Nations and have now arranged for the governance of Iraq to be overseen by the UN. That is, by the organization which welcomes all dictators as respected members and which sustains them through a variety of welfare programs financed by the free world. When we appointed Iraq's first ruling council, we did not want to insist that its members actually endorse a free society. That would be too selfish. Instead, we tried to mollify the tribal and political factions in Iraq by selecting people who represented, quote, diversity. Among the council members, all named by the U.S., were the following incomprehensible choices: the secretary of the Iraqi Communist Party, the founder of the Kurdish Socialist Party, a member of Iraq's Hezbollah, a leader of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution, which was a group funded by Iran, a group which openly advocates an Islamic theocracy, and which called on Iraqis to fight America during the 1991 Gulf War. That is how our political leaders proposed to liberate Iraq and make Americans more secure. We have now given both Afghanistan and Iraq carte blanche in writing their own constitutions, which declare that the laws of each nation are subordinate to the laws of the Quran. Contrary to the claims of President Bush, freedom is not universally valued. It is not universally valued. It did not even come into existence until the founding of America in 1776. And even in today's world, freedom is the exception among nations rather than the rule. Whether the Iraqis will ever be willing to adopt freedom is dubious. But if they are to be led to freedom, it must be America's philosophy, not Iraq's, which shapes that society. When General Douglas MacArthur headed the post-war occupation of Japan, which was also a country steeped in collectivism and authoritarianism, MacArthur rejected a constitution proposed by Japanese officials. Instead, he gave Japan a radically new constitution, written by Americans and based on the principle of individual rights. In time, Japan became a free society. This is the approach we should emulate in Iraq. Iraqis need to be taught the meaning of inalienable rights. In particular, they need to understand that no one has a right to establish a theocracy, even if it is by vote. But this is exactly what we are not doing. Instead, we are telling them that whatever they do is okay by us, as long as it reflects the will of the people. If we want to measure our success in Iraq, there is only one standard to use: America's security. America does not have a moral obligation to the Iraqis to make them free, but it does have an obligation to the American people to make Iraq into a non-threat to them. Obviously, this would be easier if Iraq became a free country. However, even if the Iraqis refuse to embrace freedom, they can certainly be prevented from becoming a new danger to us. We should issue an unequivocal warning to them. Any Iraqi action that poses a danger to us, including any alliance with the forces of Islamic totalitarianism, any such action will be met with resounding force on our part and the ousting of its government. And the same warning should be conveyed to Afghanistan. Sadly, the likelihood of such a warning being issued by us is not high. It is appalling that we allow Iran, the major promoter of Islamic totalitarianism, to go untouched by us. But it is absolutely unconscionable that we may be allowing Iraq, the country we invaded in order to make us more secure, we may be allowing Iraq to become another Iran. Defending America requires a firm commitment to our self-interest. It requires our acting by principle, not by the method of pragmatic conciliation. After the USS Pueblo was seized in international waters by North Korea in 1968, and its crew tortured for almost a year, and with the ship itself still on public display at a Korean propaganda exhibit, no retribution was ever exacted by us. After our embassy was overrun by Iran in 1979, and its occupants brutally incarcerated for 14 months, no retribution was exacted. After a U.S. manned surveillance aircraft was forced down in international airspace by China in 2001, no retribution was exacted. Let's not be too self-centered, our policymakers said. Let's think about others. Let's think about the needs of other nations, not just our own. The shapers of our foreign policy refuse to see that each time we allow ourselves to be attacked with impunity, or each time we start some military action and then retreat, we only encourage future attacks. But our enemies, including Osama bin Laden, see this clearly. Our vacillating attempt to defend against aggression has made the jihadists believe that they will prevail. They fight us because they believe that we will be unwilling to see the battle through to the end. The result of all this is an ad hoc, incoherent hash of a foreign policy, a policy that oscillates between accepting the demands of altruism and trying, intermittently, to resist those demands, but not knowing how America's interests should be defended. In foreign policy, as in other areas, most people accept the false alternative of the moral versus the practical, the supposed dichotomy between doing what is right and doing what benefits us. This impossible choice creates a perpetual self-contradiction. We don't want our wealth to be drained to feed the vultures of the world, but we are told that it is wrong to place one's needs above those of others. We want to preserve our freedom against all threats, but we are told that it is a virtue to give up that which one values most. We don't want to surrender our interests, but we don't want to reject morality either. So we face a paralyzing contradiction. The true alternative, a foreign policy that defends America's self-interest as a moral ideal, is never considered. It is time to consider it. The proper policy in foreign affairs, as in all areas of human life, is one under which rational self-interest is embraced as the good. It is a foreign policy under which the moral and the practical are in harmony, where there is no clash between what is right, individual freedom, and what benefits us, individual freedom. It is because we cling to a false moral standard that we hesitate to assert our right to live in liberty. We have permitted the loathsome insect of terrorism to crawl around, not because we lack the practical means of squashing it, but because we believe that we don't have the categorical right to put our foot down. Those who feel that we are helpless to deal with terrorism would see things very differently if they shifted their focus to the ideological realm. Terrorism, like the other political dangers we face, is growing only because of a philosophic default on our part. We have chosen self-sacrifice rather than self-interest as our standard. We have chosen compromise and appeasement rather than principled intransigence as our method of dealing with the entities that make terrorism possible. We have accepted the premise in our foreign policy, as in our domestic policy, that the individual must sacrifice his interests and his rights to the needs of others. If we are ever to be safe, this is the premise that needs to be repudiated. Individual freedom must be regarded as an absolute, never to be sacrificed. For our State Department, this means a foreign policy whose rock-solid foundation is America's self-interest. The challenge we face, then, is not how to disarm the terrorists physically, but how to arm our politicians intellectually. If we can get our leaders to grasp the true meaning of freedom, they will readily take the steps necessary to safeguard it. That is, if we can just get them to understand what it means to defend the individual's right to his life, his liberty, and the pursuit of his happiness, we will have little difficulty in getting them to defend us against the ugly threats from abroad. Thank you.